all making it back in a timely manner. Hope you got hydrated and attended to all your immediate needs. Now it's time for some more discussion. This next block of sessions is going to focus on violence against women and girls. So we're going to start the conversation on combating the global scourge of human trafficking, followed by a panel on breaking the cycle of violence against women. We're going to start with that human trafficking panel. And for context, data actually show that 27.6 million people are currently victims of trafficking worldwide. And of that number, 65% of those victims are women and girls. So this session is going to discuss the challenges and solutions to combat global trafficking, both at a global and local level. So I welcome our panel up now. Saba Ghori is Vice President at Vital Voices Global Partnership, and the panelists of that session can also come up right now. Thanks so much. Let's give them a round of applause.
Good morning, everybody. And thank you so much for that introduction. It is truly an honor to be here with you all to talk about this horrific problem around the world of trafficking in persons. We know it is one of the most horrific crimes that disproportionately affects women and girls, especially during times of conflict and chaos, such as natural disasters, war, and conflict. I am going to first introduce I'm going to introduce our speakers today, who I'm very honored to be here with. First, we have Helen Gwamfobe, who is the advisor of Nkume Fed from Cameroon. We also have with us Cindy Dyer, who is our newly appointed U.S. Ambassador to combat and monitor trafficking in persons. We're really going to talk about local-led solutions to address this issue. And we're going to kind of talk about the journey of what happened in Cameroon when Cindy and Helen worked together to push for the passage of an anti-trafficking in persons law in Cameroon. But first, let me provide a little bit more background on who they are. Cindy is the recently confirmed U.S. Ambassador at Large to monitor and combat trafficking in persons. She brings 3 decades of experience working at the local, national, and international levels to prevent and respond to human trafficking, sexual assault, and domestic violence. And she spent 12 of those years here at Vital Voices. So it's wonderful to welcome her back home. We also have with us Helen Gwamfobe, who is the advisor to a local NGO in Cameroon called Numu Fed. Although it has now spread to and has offices across Cameroon, the UK, and the US. She's been doing community service for over 25 years, and she was president of the organization from 1999 to 2009. She was instrumental in working with lawmakers and government officials to push for this passage of the child trafficking and slavery law in December of 2005. And the organization is involved in sensitization, in trauma counseling, providing skills training and economic empowerment to women and youth affected by conflict and crisis. But I first going to start off by just kind of asking you both to talk about how you met and how it all started. How did this journey begin?
Well, it's such a pleasure to be here. And when I was at Vital Voices was actually the beneficiary of a grant from the United States Trafficking in Persons Office, where I am now working. And so we have come full circle. And that grant allowed us on the human rights team to work with local women leaders in Cameroon. And so I got connected to Helen, and Vital Voices and Helen's organization in Nkume Fed did a training and helped to write a change in the law in Cameroon with Helen's leadership to make trafficking a crime, not just to traffic children, but also traffic adults. And so we met back in about 2010 and have been working, we are able to work together. And so she's such an example of a Vital Voices leader and the change that, that one of our leaders can make.
Thank you. I think my meeting, Cindy, was through the Vital Voices, my contact with the Vital Voices through the American Embassy in Cameroon. And we've worked closely with Vital Voices from 2007 till present date.
Wow. That's amazing. That's amazing. And can you both talk about some of the tactics that you used to help push for this passage of the law?
Actually, I will start with the child trafficking law. How did we get involved with this? Fed, as she has explained, is actually a world-spread, gender-based organization that deals with empowering the women and young girls, those who are vulnerable and underprivileged cases in our rural communities back home. So during our goals, working on what we are passionate about, we got involved with the International Labour Organization, which made us to know through their baseline studies that this area where we come from, the community where we come from, the Northwest region, was the main source and transit zone for child trafficking and labor. And we took upon ourselves to fight against that because it was a phenomenon that was new to us. We knew that our children were, there's poverty. We come from a real rural community in the Northwest region where our headquarters is found. So we now decided to fight against this. And we started by doing some community awareness, creating awareness by going to those hinterlands, to the churches, to women's groups, where we started now sensitizing them about this bad phenomenon that was taking place because everybody in the country came to this region to get girls, boys, to do domestic servitude, to work as sex slaves, and then some of them now were used, exploited, and dumped back to their communities. And because of poverty, they had no choice because they were going out to look for green pastures. So with the help of the International Labour Organization, because we were supported with this initiative by the American Embassy in my country and the International Labour Organization. So we identified through this creating of awareness, public creation of awareness, we got to identify cases that had actually been exploited and they were back home doing nothing. Some of them came back home with unwanted pregnancies and because of poverty. So when we identified these cases, we saw a need to construct a shelter center in our headquarters, which we did with the help of the American Embassy. And it's through that help with the American Embassy that I got to Vital Voices. Because the first time Vital Voices came to Africa to inaugurate or to start up the African chapter of Vital Voices in Cape Town, that is where I was invited by the American Embassy to go for that training, for that event. And there, when we talked about the activities that we were doing, they got involved with the activities that they were doing, they knew we were the first NGO to start the fight against trafficking in my country. So we decided to partner with us, the Vital Voices. So we worked closely with the Vital Voices at that time, and I was invited many times. Then I was the leader, the president of the organization. I was invited to many of their programs in South Africa where we had training on how to handle trafficking cases. I remember very well it was with Melissa Saba. And the first time I went for that inauguration ceremony, that's where I met Alice Nelson. And from then, we have worked with them throughout. So in 2005 now, through our advocacy and lobbying in Parliament, with some of these children that we were rehabilitating in our shelter center, we had the means to be able to pass a law with our influence in Cameroon to fight against child trafficking, which was mainly to protect the children and then the labor ages, because it now identified the ages where children could do certain work and not be exploited. But unfortunately, we were fine at that time with that law, but unfortunately, it didn't really satisfy what we wanted because the traffickers went hitch-free. They were not prosecuted. So trafficking continued in the background. So through the help, again, of the Vital Voices, with the trainings that we had gone through, they now came up when they had these grants, as Cindy explained, to work on the judiciary cases, the prosecution phase. They now had to work with Kumo Fed to be able to expand that law of 2005 on child trafficking to include trafficking in persons, which now included the adults. So now they came up with the prosecution phase of it, expanded that same law to include now the adults, and now the crime, it was now seen as a crime to be prosecuted. And through that, that is how we have been working till date.
That's such an amazing story of how that happened. And I think the audience would really love to also hear about the Justice Institutes. I want to talk a little bit about that, because we know that in these situations of gender-based violence and trafficking in persons, it is often so difficult to talk about these issues. There's a lot of shame, there's a lot of stigma, and we know that the most marginalized people, often women and girls, are most affected. And what we need are different sectors working together: government, civil society, judiciary. So talk to us a little bit about the Justice Institutes, Cindy, and what that program was about.
Well, Vital Voices recognized that in Cameroon, the government was working with Helen and other women leaders for protecting victims and helping to prevent it, but they were not working with their women leaders to investigate and prosecute cases or really partnering them. And so Vital Voices developed a Justice Institute to bring these sectors together, government and the NGO women leaders, to come together. And it was really through that partnership that Nkumu Fed and Vital Voices were able to get Cameroon to improve their law by passing a new law, and also to work together to be sure that victims of trafficking received justice, hence the name Justice Institute. And so that was something that really, and I think that's part of the Vital Voices model. It's not just a one-time utilize your women leaders to make sure that children have services. No, we need to use them in every stage of the trafficking process: prevention, prosecution, protection, and partnership ongoing. And so I think that was our model with the Justice Institute, and Helen is such a perfect example of the benefit that you get when you really work closely with your women leaders.
Thank you, Cindy. And Helen, what are you seeing now as some of the current gaps in implementation of this law? And would you say that also the work has still continued, with the task forces and all of that you mentioned?
Yeah, the work is still continuing, because the task forces that Cindy and her team came to train, especially the one in the Northwest region where we come from, our headquarters is the only vibrant task force that is there, and they are doing a lot because the stakeholders in the TIP, in trafficking in persons, they are all in the platform of that task forces, and they do a lot to follow up with the prosecution. And Kumo Fed, our PG now, our President General now, is the secretary of that task force, and they've been doing a lot to help in the prosecution of the law. But let me state one thing here. Talking about the gap in the law, the thing is, the tactics, as I said, was the voice of Vital Voices, because they amplified their voices to make the government decide now to work back on that law, to go back on that law and expand it. And now, working, they know that Kumufefe were like a watchdog. Yes, in the whole process, because they know we work with the Vital Voices and the American Embassy in my country. So the thing is that the gap in the law is, it talks about prosecution a lot about the crime, but doesn't give a lot of room for the prevention, the protection, that's the responses, and the partnership, as she says. So there is that gap, but that gap has strengthened the work of the civil society organizations to which we are part of, to strengthen also our prevention, protection, and partnership measures, because it has given us an opportunity to work with other partners, because usually we design projects that help us to take care of these cases. Because I would like you to know that currently in Cameroon, there is a civil crisis, a socio-political crisis that is taking place. And that region in the Northwest is hard hit because that is where the conflict actually is. And we have now cases of gender-based violence and trafficking on the rise. So there's a lot of chaos as far as implementing the law is concerned.
Yeah.
But because of that task force that is there, and the fact that Komofefed is part of this task force, we are now the current and maybe only NGO that actually goes to the field with these identified cases of gender-based violence that we have. We now withdraw them and train them in vocational service skills and doing some coaching on entrepreneurial business, little small businesses, and at the end we give them support to the starters to be able to survive. That is, we give the victims, we transform them to survivors. And thanks to our training from the Vital Voices, because it has empowered us a lot in our activities as a civil society organization. And the one thing I want to say here is that we are still working on it, and we hope that this law again may be revised one day with the influence of what is happening now. We're hoping that one day, of course, the civil crisis may come to an end, but right now, we are really still struggling. But I'd like you to know that even with that, with the work that Komofefed is doing, Komofefed has a mandate every year of withdrawing identified cases of gender-based violence and trafficking and rehabilitating them and reinstating them back into the society. Wow. And just through the steps that I mentioned. And we are really doing a great job as far as that is concerned, because recently, you would like to know that Komofefed, myself, and our President General will be on a Vital Voices program, Voices Against Violence. And it really empowered us a lot, helped us to improve on our platform of strengthening our referral paths for reporting cases of gender-based violence and trafficking. And we are still hoping that at the end of it all, because we are still in the process of waiting for a sub-grant that will help us also to carry out some of the activities. And we have a project going right now with the European Union, which is helping us to recuperate some of these cases, to rehabilitate them in our center.
Wow. You know, Helen, just hearing you talk about all of these efforts, you've talked about prevention, you've talked about protection, you've talked about prosecution. You've also mentioned some of these programs like the Voices Against Violence Initiative, which is a public-private partnership between Vital Voices, the Department of State, and Avon. Again, a program that has 3 different sectors of society working together, because the only way this will work is if we all work together to combat this horrific problem. Cindy, now I would love for you to talk a little bit about, I know we have to wrap up, but last question, about your office's mission with the 4 Ps, protection, prevention, prosecution, and partnership, and how this was a great model of that, working together. How can that be replicated? What needs to take place for this model to be used elsewhere around the world?
Well, actually, you bring up such a good point, and building on what Helen had said, this is a perfect example of, Vital Voices partnered with Helen to engage in not only the prevention, protection, prevention and partnership, but also then Helen turns around, and you hear it in the way she talks, and reinvests that into empowering survivors. And that's the critical piece of the partnership that needs to be added. To your point, it's not just partnership with NGO and government and women leaders, but it's also with the survivors, those with lived experience. Their value, their expertise needs to be included. And this is such a perfect example, and exactly what Helen has done. Turn around, reinvest what Vital Voices invested in her. She is reinvesting in survivor advocates so that their voice comes to the table. That is really bringing it full circle. And then we become truly trauma-informed, victim-centered. And so it's that full circle. And so really building off of what Helen said, it's a perfect example.
Thank you so much, Cindy and Helen. Do we have time for Okay. Well, I thought we might have, I'm getting no's. I thought we might have some time for questions and answers, but I hope that you all were able to kind of see this example of an ideal program that works when you have civil society, governments, survivors working together to make change. And at the center and core is women leaders and their voices. So thank you so much for being with us today.